What's happening, Fish and Friends? I have a nice clean Lew's Speed Spool LFS frame here, but now we just have to get all those parts put back on it. So in today's video, we're going to discuss assembling this reel, adding the grease and lube, putting in some new ceramic bearings right there, and I'll answer some questions that I received from viewers on the first video. Now, speaking of that first video, I went over how to disassemble and get all this clean. So if you missed part one, I'll have that video linked at the end of this one. But enough talking, let's get this put back together. So we need to gather materials. First, we're gonna need all of the tools that we had from part one: tweezers, wrench, screwdriver, channel lock, all that. Of course, some shop towels to clean up any mess. Next, we're gonna need some grease. Now, this is all based on personal preference. You ask 5 different individuals who work on reels which grease is best, there's a good chance you're gonna get 5 different answers. I've personally had excellent luck with the standard Shimano grease in the little white tub. I tried this Ardent Reel Butter a couple years ago. I wasn't a huge fan of it. I didn't feel that it stuck very well, but I know a number of people that like it. You could use Cow's Drag Grease, Quantum Hot Sauce. There's a number of them out on the market. I picked up some of this. This is the Abu Garcia Precision Grease, and I had good luck with it. I felt that it stuck pretty well, so I'm gonna continue using this till it's out. Now, I also got some of the Spool Speed Fluidine grease. It's another one I'm going to test out. So as a beginner, grab some of that Shimano grease in the little white tub. Can't go wrong with it. Next is the oil, and again, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of this on the market. This is some of the free oil that I got with one of my reels. I don't remember which one, but oftentimes some of the $100 plus reels are going to come with their own oil. So I'm just going to use that. For example, this is the oil that I got with the Shimano SLX. This is the same oil that they use on the Bantam oil. So, pretty nice oil comes with them. You can use that. I've also got a high-speed oil. I picked this up on my order when I got my Spool Speed bearings. I know ZPI makes some of this. Lightning Lube, I think it's from Boca, makes some of this. I got this specifically for my bearings. As you can see, it's a less viscous oil, more watery. It's going to help those bearings run freer instead of putting, more of a regular oil in there. It's going to tend to slow those bearings down. Now, as a beginner, is this necessary? Absolutely not. Just use the free oil that you got with your reel. Otherwise, you can pick up a small thing of oil on Tackle Warehouse for pretty cheap. I've also got some Q-tips to clean up anything and a small paintbrush to apply grease. All right, let's start by getting the bearings put in our side plates so we don't forget about these. I've completely degreased the factory bearings. Take a look at this. You see that? They actually spin now. I degreased these. I didn't do a crazy job on them. I didn't, thoroughly soak them for a long time because I'm changing these out. But that's what you're going to do. Again, just with the CRC brake clean and the red can, make sure it's the red can, not the green can. Just the regular brake clean and clean those out. Some people I know use an ultrasonic cleaner on them. I didn't go to that crazy of measures to do it because, again, I'm going to be changing these out. Once you get them clean and put them back in, you're going to put a drop of oil on them. Now remember, the more oil that you put on those bearings, the less freely they're going to spin. Now they're going to be quiet, but they're not going to spin as freely. And as a beginner, you don't even need to worry about degreasing these. You can just leave the grease in there. They're shielded. Those are going to be good for years to come. So it's completely up to you. You will notice a difference if you just oil them. They're going to spin freer, less resistance, but as a beginner, you don't have to go to all that. All right, but I'm going to be putting the ceramic bearings in here. These are the ones I picked up from Spool Speed. Look at the difference on those. So that's what we're putting in this. I'm going to start with the side plate that's opposite of the handle. I'm a right-hand retrieve, so this is on my left-hand side. Put that baby in there, and there's just a little clip that goes in. Just this little clip, and that's where I use the tweezers to put this in. All right, so to install this, I'm going to put it in, and there's just a little tiny ledge that this fits under in here. You'll see as I push this down, like so. You can see I got that side started. There's that little tiny edge there that it sits under, so I got that on. Flip this around and show you this way. I'm just going to grab this and gently push it down, and it should sit right up under there. Just like that. So I've got both sides in. You want to go around and make sure that none of these little edges are sticking out. You want to make sure you don't jam this down into the bearing. That will mess up how the bearing spins. So just under that little edge. Exact same process for the spool tension bearing. Drop that baby in there. Going to do the same thing on this side. I've already got that little retainer clip started. I'm just going to push it in just like that. It sits right under that little ledge there, and that's all you've got to do to install those. Next is going to be the spool bearing, and this one is pretty easy as well. So you're going to take your spool bearing. It's a little bit larger inside diameter. You can see there that baby's on and going. Now this one's easy. You just make sure that you have to use a whole lot of common sense and just a little bit of force. That's what Scott over at Spool Speed says. When you're putting these in, be very careful with that pin. It's small and you can very easily damage it, so be careful. Now again, remember there are 2 different sizes to the spool pin. I put the small end in. I'm going to be pushing on the larger end. As you can see there, I'm going to push very slow and gently. Very slow, making sure the spool pin is straight up and down so I don't bend it. Put a warp in it or anything. Not using a lot of force, just gently pushing it. And there we go. Spool pin is in. You just want to make sure it's even on both sides, and that's all there is to that. So those are my bearings on. Didn't want to forget about those. All right, next let's move over to the frame. Remember, I'm going to work in the opposite order from when I took this apart. So let's first start with the level wind assembly and everything up front. So I'm going to start with the sleeve here and line guide, and I put my line guide in here so I always remember that I have it. You want to make sure you don't get all this put together and then all of a sudden realize that a whole reel's back together and you forgot to put your line guide on, because then you got to take a bunch of stuff apart. So pull that off there. I want to make sure I've got this in my hand and I remember to do it, because when I take this sleeve and put it inside there, I have to make sure that this line guide goes in just like that. And I want to make sure I've got my line guide pointing the right way. The paw's going to go there, so everything looks good. Next, I need my worm gear, and that's going to go in from the opposite side. So I'm going to push it from this way and in, so that little end with the little spot for the pin sticks out here. I need to grab the bearing that supports the worm gear. That will go on next, just like so, and that sits right down in there. I will need the little white gear that goes over that, and the white gear side with the little notches in it right there. That's where that pin's going to sit. That side goes up. Now I like to take just a little tiny bit of grease and put right on there where that pin goes in. That way it just kind of sticks, so when you're doing this it makes it easier to put that pin in and not lose it. Next I'm going to take my tweezers and put the little pin in there just like that. I'm going to push it like so and push it out the other end and make it sit in there just like that. That way as you're turning this and moving it, that grease kind of helps keep that on there, and I wipe off the excess. Not a huge glob, just enough to kind of make that pin stick. So I'm going to hold that in place and flip this over, and we're going to get this side put together. I need my little white bushing. You can see that there's a spot or a little slot for that to fit in. Top of it sits in just like that. We finished putting this together by adding this guy on top of there. Remember what that is? The E-ring. And a gentleman that watched my first video calls these things the oh crap clips, because as you go to put them on, end up shooting it halfway across the room, you go, oh crap! I'm just going to hold this like so and take the back side of my tweezers just like that and push it straight down on, and that baby clips right on there. I'm going to get my pawl put in. Of course, the side with the teeth goes down in because that runs in the groove of my worm gear there. I'm going to put my cap on, and inside this cap is a little washer. You can see it inside there. I put just a little drop of oil in there to keep it in there so I didn't lose it. I'm also going to put just a tiny drop of oil right here, just like so. You don't need much, and put that cap on. Now that we got the cap on, we can put on our little bar that assists the line guide here as it moves back and forth, and that just fits through and sits in a little groove on the opposite side here. Push that in the little hole on the other side just like that. Now we can put our front plate on to hold all this together. Okay, just like that, the front plate goes on, and there's one little screw on the other side. Screw that in. Okay, so now our whole line guide assembly is put back together. None of that's going to fall out. Once I get that all greased up, it'll be good to go. Okay, let's give a test to that. That is good to go. My line guide's working back and forth. Now let's move over to our main gear assembly. All right, we'll start by putting in the bearing in here that assists that crankshaft as you set that down in there. This piece right here, that's what's going to sit down in that bearing and assist it. Going to oil this bearing. This one I did also degrease. This is not one of the ceramic bearings. This is not a high spin bearing. So I put just a little bit more in here than normal because I don't want to be having to take this off in the middle of the season. You know, this gets screwed on here and it's buried completely, and I don't want to have to take the whole reel apart. And because this piece is moving here, I'm also going to put a drop of oil in there. Just like that, good to go. All right, so let's get that crankshaft on. It fits down in here, and just a couple screws hold it in. As you can see now, this does function and make my line guide move back and forth, so we're good. All right, there's one, the first one done. And remember, as you put these screws in, do not over tighten them. You just want to get them nice and snug down, but don't keep wrenching on them. All right, and there is the second screw. So we've got our crankshaft completely on, that's working. Let's move over here to the clutch cam assembly. The first step there will be to set this clutch cam onto the frame here, this first part that starts it out. You can see that moves up and down as you depress the thumb bar. But before I do that, I want to get those pieces greased. Now, as you can see here, there's a couple of gray spots on the frame where those pieces rub. Here, here. Even here I put it on. Now with it being, you know, the aluminum on plastic, you probably don't need to, but I've always done it. Just any of these parts here where those are moving, just a tiny layer of grease. Now a good rule of thumb on this grease is to only use the grease on gears and bushings, but I do like to use just the tiniest layer on these parts of the frame that are moving. You don't want to have globs all over, otherwise it's going to have the reverse effect on your reel and not make it as smooth if it's just caked with grease everywhere. So up here, any of those parts where that piece is going to rub, I'm going to put it on there. Again, you can see that piece here, and again, just a thin layer of grease. I'm just kind of spreading it around on there. Just like that, all the way around where that's going to rub. Not tons of it everywhere, just a nice thin layer, just going to help it move. Okay, so we're ready to put that clutch cam piece on, but make sure you have your kick lever under here. That little piece fits under there just like so. You don't want to get this all put together and forget that part because you're going to have to take it all off again. I also need to make sure my clutch spring is on there, so I'm going to lift that little piece of this up and put that spring right in the back of that there. Just like that, so it's loaded and ready to go now. I'm going to take and put the spring in the hole where it goes up here first before I put this clutch cam down in where it goes on the frame. So I'm going to put that on here, just like that. So you can see I put the spring in up here. The other part of the spring goes here. And what I'm going to do is take this and just gently press it up to compress that spring. That'll fit right down onto that piece on the frame. It's a whole lot easier doing it this way than trying to get that all put on here under it and get that spring pushed up in there by itself. So just a little trick. Next is a little kicker lever spring here. I'll move this out and just do this with the tweezers. This spring is not as strong, so I can do this completely with the little tweezers here. All right, push that down in there just like that, and that's the second spring. Now we can check just to make sure that this works. Now remember, you don't have screws or anything in it, but my thumb bar is going to press down and back up. So we know we're working there. All right, now that we've got that on and all the springs are in, I can put my cam plate on. And again, I'm just going to grease this little part on the back of it where it's going to rub. Just the tiniest amount of grease. That's too much. There we go. Just going to thin that out to a real tiny thin layer of grease on there, just like that, just so it kind of looks wet. No visual globs. The cam plate will set down on here and it'll line up with those screw holes. I can then put my 3 little screws on. These are different sizes. You can see the 2 on the actual plate are a little bit smaller and longer. The one at the bottom is a little bit shorter and stouter. Now again, because these are going into plastic right there, do not over tighten them, just get them snug. And number 2, and the third and final screw down in the bottom here. All right, now that my 3 screws are in, I don't want to forget this little piece. I think they call it the idler plate. I don't know why, but there it is. That little piece goes on there, and then just 2 little screws that hold it in. Little tiny screw goes right here on the side of it. And the second larger screw goes right here. All right, so we've got all the pieces on here. We can test for function. Everything works there. Looks good. Now, for you beginners that watched the first video, if you're just getting into cleaning your baitcaster, you can leave a lot of this on here. When I first started cleaning my own, this is all the farther I went. I didn't take, the line guide off. I didn't take all this assembly off. I just went to this, pulled the gears off, cleaned all this up, and put them back on. And that will still drastically help improve the life of your reel. All right, now before I forget, I'm going to put my thumb bar on back here. That plastic piece just sits here. That's what you push down with your thumb. And there's a little tiny screw that goes right in here. It's kind of hard to get to, so that's again why these little tweezers come in handy so much. Set it in there and you're good. Screw that baby in. Voila, good to go. All right, before we get the cam and the main gear and everything on here, I want to make sure I grease any of these other spots that are moving as I go. So I'm just going to take my little paintbrush here, load it with a little bit of grease, put that on here. Again, not a ton, and I'm just going to go about halfway around this little gear. It doesn't have to be anything too crazy. This doesn't need to be crazy lube because these are 2 plastic gears, so just a little bit in there. And I keep some Q-tips close by that way in case you get any little globs on the actual frame or anything. You can just clear them off real quick. And I spread that grease around. I just give this a twist like so, and that works the grease around on those gears. Perfect. Now, as I flip my reel over, I'm going to put just a little grease over here right on this bushing where this E-ring kind of rolls around in there, I guess, slides around. Put just a little bit of grease inside there like that and work it around, just so that's got a little bit of lubrication on there too. All right, now that we've got that done, let's get our main gear and the drag stack and everything put on here. So first will be the ratchet. There's a ratchet washer that goes on top of there. Now the ratchet, you want to make sure it just kind of sits down in a little piece here. You can see there. Want to make sure it sits down in there. If you have it off, it'll look like that. See how there's a little space in there? You want to move that ratchet till it lines up and sits right down in just like that. So it's nice and flush with the bottom. Now the points on the ratchet are always going to point backward, and you can see as you press that thumb bar down, it's pushing this up in the way, and then when you turn your handle, it takes that ratchet, pushes that back up and out of the way, and then you can go ahead and turn your reel. Now the only thing I put just a tiny bit of grease behind that ratchet washer just so it stuck to the ratchet so I didn't lose it. I don't put anything else on the top of it. The next thing that's going to go on is the main gear, but first we need to get that baby greased. So to get this greased, I'm going to grab my precision grease here and just do a tiny bead about halfway to 2/3 away around the gear. So just a tiny little thin bead all the way around, then I'm going to push it in with my finger. Take my finger and push all that down into it. Any excess I'm going to wipe off. Make sure I don't have globs of it all around everything. Okay, so there you can see I've got just a little bit of grease inside there, and again, it's only about halfway around it. That's all I want to do. Okay, now that that's all greased up, my main gear can go on there just like that. It sits right on top of there. Next to go on the stack is the drag, and I'm going to keep my drag washer dry. This is kind of that plastic rubbery substance feel. Now if you had like the carbon fiber drag, you can take just a little bit of grease and put it in between your finger and thumb and just barely tap around it just so there's the thinnest layer around there. But the more grease you have on here, it will make your drag nice and smooth when a fish starts pulling drag off. But the more grease that you get on here, it's going to reduce that drag power. Drag works off of friction, so if you have no friction, a whole bunch of grease in there, it's going to reduce the drag power that you've got. So that piece goes on there just like that, and that sits in the middle of my main gear. The metal drag washer goes on after that. It pushes down in there. There's a little tiny thin washer that goes right up over that, like so. Okay, and to finish this off, the final thing we've got to put in is our yoke and pinion. That's this little piece here. And the pinion and yoke, in case you're wondering, it's a little sleeve right there that holds the pinion. The pinion is what the spool is going to fit into, and those little, as you can see there, the spool pins fit right inside this pinion, and that's what drives it. So as you're cranking that main shaft, that's what's turning your spool right there. So no need to grease this. I have greased it before and I haven't really noticed a difference, but again, you don't want globs and globs of it all over. The grease from the main gear here is going to transfer over to this pinion, so you don't have to worry about that. Now one thing I am going to grease are these two little posts that stick up. Because that yoke is going to be moving up and down on those, I want just the thinnest layer. I'm also going to put just a tiny bit of grease here where that yoke sits, just to make sure any sort of movement on there is free. Next is going to be the pinion and yoke. Remember the side that's got the big kind of gaps there where the spool pin is going to sit in, that's going to go on the bottom. That should fit in there just like so. You can see that we're well on our way to getting this put back together. Now that we've got just a tiny bit of grease on those posts, I'm going to add my springs here to the side of that, and I think the inside should be all good and ready. I do just a quick over to make sure I've got all my parts up here, put inside there before I get it put back together. Now, before we get the side plate on, I do want to talk about that roller bearing. Now with this, I don't do anything special. I got that all cleaned out. I didn't do any sort of heavy degrease or anything. I just take a Q-tip and run around inside there and get the dirty grease out. Now I'm going to take a clean Q-tip and put just a couple dabs of oil on here so it soaks down into the Q-tip. I'm going to take this oiled Q-tip and run it just on the inside of these roller bearings, not a ton. It's going to be just a little bit of oil to coat that on the inside of there so it moves freely, but not enough, a big, huge ton amount to gunk it all up. Okay, so now that that's on and oiled and ready to go, again, I'm just going to double check to make sure that ratchet and everything's sitting flush, everything looks good. I can have my side plate. That's going to fit down on there. The sleeve is going to fit down on the inside of that. Make sure we have a good fit. Looks great. Now I kept my screws in order up here. You can see it's going to be the same as my side plate. So my top left, top right, and bottom screw. 1, 2, and 3. Got to put my last screw on the underside here, and that holds the little lube port cover there, and that'll be the 4th screw to put that all together. Next, we've got our little drag clicker. That's going to go on, and then the 2 little drag washers. And again, make sure you have those so they form a little space inside there. You don't want them where they're stuck together. You want those to be opposite with a space in between, like so. Those are going to go on and sit in there like that. All right, I can put my star drag back on. That goes on just like so, and you kind of have to hold the main handle here as you get that past the little clicker. All right, now that that's all together, while I have this open and before I put my spool tension knob on, I'm going to add some of this bearing lube, and I'm only going to do like a half of a little drip inside there, just the tiniest amount. That's it, just a little touch. That's all I want in there. I can go ahead and put my spool tension cap back on. You can see that little dark spot there. That's where the spool is going to rub. I'm going to add one little tiny drop of lube in there. So just the tiniest drop of oil in there, just like that, so it doesn't run around. You can see as I move it, it's not going anywhere. It's just one little tiny drop. That's just so when that spool shaft rubs on it, it gives it a little lubrication. I can add my handle and the nut that holds the handle on. 10mm wrench to tighten it down. Next will be the cap that holds it on like so, and then the little screw. All right, handle's on now. We're on the home stretch. Before I put these in, again, I'm going to use just like a half or a third drop of oil, just the tiniest amount. Just touch it onto it. That's all I want to do. Now I am going to add just the tiniest drop to this side of the spool shaft, just like that, just so I've got a tiny bit of oil on there. Can drop my spool in, and last but not least, the side plate. And if I did it all right, oh yeah, that baby feels smooth. Check this out. I'd say she runs now. Okay, so the last thing we need to do before we put this back on the rod is lubricate our worm gear, which is that silver part up in here with the teeth. We need to lube that. Now I've used both types of lubrication on this. A lot of people will tell you absolutely do not ever use grease on it. Well, when these come from the factory, they've got grease on them. The nice thing about grease is it stays longer, so you can really put that on all season without having to re-oil it. So if you're somebody that doesn't like to do reel maintenance, I've used grease and you're not going to have an issue. Some people say that you get a bunch of dirt stuck in there, it's going to trap stuff, you're going to have issues. I've never had a problem with it. But most people use oil on the worm gear. Again, it completely depends on who you talk to. I know people that do it both ways. On this one, I am going to put oil because this is my frog reel. It's a whole lot more susceptible to getting a whole bunch of gunk and stuff in there. And it is easier to clean when you use just oil in there. You know, you use your alcohol and cotton swabs to get all that cleaned out. So that's why I'm doing oil on this. And so I'm just going to put a drop on each side. One there. I'm going to turn my handle to rotate that, and that'll go to the other side that I can put a drop in the middle and on the other side. Okay, I've got my oil in there. I'm going to work it back and forth. Feels nice and smooth. So that is it. I hope you all enjoyed. Now beginners, remember, start small. Start by just removing this handle side plate, cleaning the internals. You don't have to take the main shaft, the worm gear, all that off. Start small with small reel maintenance and your reels will last you longer. If you're somebody that's been looking to take that next step and do a deep clean and try that, I hope this helped you out. If you're the last type of person that doesn't want to do any reel maintenance yourself, again, I give a big, huge thanks to Ben over at Slayer Reel Tuning, Adam at Reel Integrity, Lionell at A Dose of Reel, and Scott at Spool Speed. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for taking the time to explain how you clean your reels. That way I can give folks a different perspective when I put this video together. So that's going to do it for the night, folks. I hope you all enjoyed. It is late. I got to get to bed.